Welcome to the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Brad Glosserman. Brad is a senior advisor at the Pacific Forum and the deputy director and visiting professor of the Center for Rulemaking Strategies at Tama University, as well as the author of a number of books on the issue of the trilateral relationship between South Korea, Japan, and America. And this, of course, is a relationship that comes from a deep and painful history. Not just the colonization of Korea by Japan, but also a deeper history of invasions, attacks, and sporadic warfare. And it is histories like this that builds national identities today. Current disputes such as those with the issue of comfort women, reparations and apologies for war crimes, and territorial disputes such as Dokdo become not just issues important in their own right, but issues central to the nation itself. Points where compromise, or even forward progress, become near impossible. Which is why the relationship between South Korea and Japan is such a remarkable one. For underscoring all of this is a highly functional grassroots relationship. These two countries are interconnected in near countless ways. And a significant factor in all this has been both of their relationships with the United States of America. And that's not just America's role as a facilitator of cooperation, or a country that brings them together as allies under the same banner. This trilateral relationship has helped solidify their importance through shared values, geographical proximity, economic interests, as liberal democracies, and importantly through their shared national security interests. America's role in this is significant. During the Barack Obama administration, they had the pivot to Asia, and the fears of a nuclear North Korea, or a rise in China increasingly asserting itself in the East Asian region, is naturally something that America is seeking deeper alliances to counter, and their ability to project present power into the future. Which brings some new dynamics to the table. This is now the Donald Trump administration, and of course the Moon Jae-in administration in South Korea. And through both these figures, the outlook on the region and the interests involved seem to have shifted. Trilateral defense talks have continued, the sharing of military information is still there, the alliance remains deep in the fabric of these nations, and underscoring all of this is a demographic challenge facing both South Korea and Japan. A feeling that in the future these countries are going to have to accept a changed position in the world. The high growth rates of the past are perhaps over, and they are going to have to find ways to deal with the future of their country, their cultural identity, and their likely decline in wealth, at least internationally, and the new place in the world in which they're going to find themselves. Which of course offers countless new dimensions for this trilateral relationship, which Brad Glosserman is going to talk us through today. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. And if you do want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account attached below or the PayPal link next to it. Or alternatively, you can simply share, like, or comment on this post across social media. All this help is greatly appreciated. On that, and to talk us through the future relationship between America, Japan, and South Korea, this is Brad Glosserman. Brad Glosserman, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So as we talk through the trilateralism between America, South Korea, and Japan, there is a deep history here. And before we get back and so deep into and dig into some of these issues, perhaps we should go back a little bit and touch just on the tangled histories between these three countries, and in some ways the status quo that developed, before Lee Moon-bak era. With America and America imposing a sort of cooperation in the region. So I might take us back at first to a little bit of deep history and the American influence on the trilateral relationship.
Sure thing. We're allowed to be historical in the age of social media. It seems to me to be a struggle.
Be as historical as you like, yeah.
No worries. The formative, it almost depends on what your time frame is. The usual inclination is to sort of start with the occupation and the brutal Japanese colonization of the Korean Peninsula in the early part of the 20th century. And it was a fairly savage as occupation and colonialists were at that time in world history. And the result was a very, very sad legacy and deep, deep anger at the Japanese once the Koreans regained their independence in 1945 after the defeat of Japan in World War II. And that, of course, has been what's colored the relationship to this day. A profound feeling on the part of South Koreans that the Japanese have never truly come to grips with the entirety of that history, whether it be in the particular misdeeds. Not only, of course, mind you, the comfort women, the forced labor, the exploitation of the resources, etc., but also, if you will, the attempt to virtually exterminate the local culture, the expropriation, the theft, if you will, of cultural artifacts, which have gradually, many but not all, have been returned. And just, if you will, the war on South Korea and South Korea as an independent entity that occurred during that time. In fact, though, I mean, you really, having said all that, you probably even need to go back far, far further, several hundred centuries ago, when you see that many of some of the key components of Japanese culture are likely to have emanated on the Korean Peninsula. And it's well known here, although the degree to which people want to admit it, it varies, that in fact South Korea provided was the original bloodline for the Japanese royal family. And many of the tombs in this country of the old emperors are closed officially in the name of privacy, but also because there's, I think, a concern that, and not just mine, but the scholars and experts would acknowledge, it's probably because they've got very clear indicators of Korean origin, and that would be inconvenient, if you will, for the Japanese. The emperor, the previous emperor, the Heisei emperor, who abdicated at the end of last month, actually went so far as to acknowledge as much in the oblique way the Japanese imperial family talks. And that was, I think, a fairly bold and accurate and should have been well appreciated move. I think very much in keeping with his character. So that origin creates, if you will, a real interesting dynamic to the overlay in contemporary problems, right? In the sense that it gives us, I think, an ambivalence, a reason to acknowledge the deep ties, and I think to give hope, if you will, for the future of the relationship, and at the same time to, if you will, plant certain seeds of, like I said, ambivalence that takes both countries in interesting directions when they look and think about the other. So if you go back several hundred years, you've got, if you will, this merging or of the two cultures. Then you've got the brutalities of the Japanese occupation period, and then you have in the post-war the fact that it was, in many crude ways to put it, the Korean War, which was a springboard for Japanese development in the 1950s because the United States used Japan and provided so much economic assistance that it really goosed the economy. And then subsequent to that, you have the normalization agreement in 1965, which is, as I'm sure your listeners know, and I'm sure we'll discuss, continues to be a real sore spot in the relationship to this day. Then, and subsequent to that, the Japanese provided the much or a significant amount of funds pursuant to that agreement that allowed the South Korean economy to take off and to begin its industrialization and modernization. And in addition to the money, there was, of course, the Japanese political economic model that Park Chung-hee, the Korean leader, dictator at that time, adopted, which also, I think, ties and is another indication of, if you will, the reasons that the two countries should look at each other with considerably less jaundiced eyes. I mean, that takes us, I think that's in the broad sweep of the relationship. That'll take us up to about the beginning of the 21st century. Is there anything you'd like me to add to that, or is there anything you feel as though I should
that's a good little history there, but I might get you to just bring in the role that America has played, perhaps, and how much they have facilitated this, or how it's been organic, or how, I suppose, just how they've driven the whole process or not driven it, in your view.
Well, I think by and large, the argument, the U.S. didn't have to drive it a great deal, except in the 1980s when there was a particular blip, which I guess I should get to. But I mean, if you read the histories of the American alliance system in Asia, and the contrast with Europe is striking. So in Europe, you have the creation of NATO in the aftermath of World War II, and what you have is the creation of a multilateral structure, right, in which the United States is working with a group of countries, all like-minded countries in the region. And of course, there's the parallel development of the European Union, which the United States supported in various forms and fashions. And all of that together meant that there were mechanisms by which Washington could work with the individual partners and bring them all together for concerted action and to work for a common purpose and a common cause. In Asia, there was never a multilateral structure established. In fact, the U.S. went out of its way to establish a hub and spokes model, and by and large kept the spokes very separate and did not encourage, until only a decade or two ago, in the end of the Cold War at the very earliest, some real coordination between the various, if you say, the spokes on the alliance wheel. And there's a number of explanations for why that might have been. Some people speculate, and there's probably some truth, that it was just pure racism, that there was a belief that Asians were not capable of working together. There was the fact that while their civilizations, if you will, to call it that, or their cultures were very long age and of extraordinary richness, diversity, and they had incredible riches and depth. In fact, as modern states, they were relatively new, and these countries were probably not prepared to make the sacrifices in terms of, or not prepared to give up components of sovereignty that were relatively new to them at the time. Nor was there, I think, a sense that they could probably be brought together in a meaningful way. So multilateralism was both discouraged, I think, and out as a practical option. So you had the United States ensuring a set of bilateral relationships, and by and large across the region, you had very distinct and discrete security threats, capabilities of partners, et cetera. So it was hard to bring everybody together in a common purpose. In Northeast Asia, you could say that Japan and South Korea were probably, in many ways, very close to each other. And if there was an opportunity for cooperation, that would have been it. But I think that kind of omits or forgets history. I mean, when I first went to Korea back in the 1990s, the early 1991, I was told by my Japanese friends that Taiwan is Japan 10 years ago and Korea is Japan 20 years ago. So there was even a sense, I think, at that time, about the differences in capabilities of societies, of economies, of maturation of the political systems. And even more so, obviously, I think it also speaks to a level of arrogance, if you will, or just that sense of condescension, perhaps, when it comes to looking at South Korea, that still manages, I think, in many ways, to pervade thinking about South Korea here in Japan. But the U.S., nevertheless, there are some moments where clearly the U.S. intervened. And the one that I'm thinking of right now is when the Korean, at that time, democracy dissident Kim Daejung, who was living in, or at least visiting Japan in the early 1980s, was kidnapped by Korean CIA agents from a hotel in Tokyo and was being spirited back to Korea. In theory, there's some belief, I think, whether it's fact, but most people believe, I think rightly so, that the Korean CIA agents were going to kill Kim on the return, perhaps dump him in the Sea of Japan. And the United States found out about it, found them, and basically warned the South Korean government at that time, a military dictatorship, that would be a huge, terrible mistake, but also then sweetened the pot by making it clear that letting him live, that at that time the president of South Korea would be invited to the White House for a reception with President Reagan. So that's, one of the direct interventions that you can see in, the United States in the relationship between the two countries. And of course, back in the 1950s, you could say that again, in the Korean War, you had opportunities for the United States to kind of coordinate or align the interests of Washington and Seoul. But at that time, I think neither of those governments, certainly under attack, the Korean government had little, I think, to think about in terms of that kind of coordination. The Japanese were weak, and Article 9 prevented them from making some sort of really substantive contributions to any sort of war effort, other than, if you will, proving as a logistics and servicing point and rallying point for all the resupply of Allied forces on the peninsula during the fighting. So the U.S. role really, I don't think, takes shape until after the Cold War, when you begin both to have a far more capable Korean military. You have a Japanese political system that's beginning to slip, if you will, a little bit the shackles of the constitutional and legal constraints imposed by Article 9, and which you have, while you've always had if you will, a wink and a nod kind of acknowledgement of the need for South Korea and Japan to work together, and the Japanese to make active contributions to the security on the Korean Peninsula. You really never had, I think, the larger set of conditions that would allow the U.S. to knock heads together, or just bring the countries together in ways to deal with common security threats. Again, as I think about it, there is actually one other incident where you had trilateral cooperation. That was when the downing of Korean Airlines Flight 007 by a Russian fighter. It was, if you will recall, it was a horrible, tragic incident in which the Russians, or the Soviets at that time, mistakenly shot down a passenger aircraft and killing everyone on board. And at that time, and it's never discussed much, the Japanese, Koreans, and the United States mounted a trilateral search and rescue to try to find the black boxes from the planes to determine what had happened. Nobody talks about it. Nobody talked about it because it was extremely sensitive, but it was a very high stakes operation under great pressure because the Soviets at that time were doing everything they could to harass the ships and prevent them from completing the mission. And in fact, it turned out, of course, that the Soviets already had the black boxes and turned them back over, I believe, to Korea during when Boris Yeltsin was president. So that is, I think, a good take on the history up to, again, like I said, the beginning of the 21st century.
And from that history, how close is the relationship between just Japan and just Korea? How close has that relationship actually become? So it's a good history there, and we have this idea of America trying to facilitate wherever they can. But how close have they become? Because at least in theory, as you mentioned, there's a lot of reasons for them to, in some ways, become closer allies, and in some ways, there's a history and an identity politics tearing them apart. So before we get into the identity politics and the problems that come along with that, just how close has the relationship been over the years? It seems on paper that they are members of ASEAN and APEC and the G20 and even part of the six-party talks. And of course, we will talk about North Korea in just a second. So how successful has the relationship been between the two countries over the years? Has it managed to function well, even under the shadow of some of the history and some of the identitarian politics?
Well, first of all, just as a technical point, they're not members of ASEAN because that's only Southeast Asia, but they are dialogue partners of ASEAN, and they are part of the ASEAN plus 3 dialogue framework. I mean, it is, clearly the relationship has been fraught through the entire post-war period. I think the issue was the degree to which both of them could afford to really focus on the other, and, if you will, the degree to which they can indulge the particularities of their domestic, political, or social consciousness. So, until during the Cold War, there was the combined concern about the Soviet threat, and that I think that managed to overshadow any of the problems that have really come to dominate the relationship this day. The Soviet threat for you young folks. I mean, I'm a little older than I think you are, Jed, and perhaps, unfortunately, increasingly much of the world. I'm not that old either, which is what's scary. But, the Soviet threat was all-consuming. There was a real concern that we had to remain vigilant. We had to do everything we could to ensure that the Soviet Union and communist ideology did not make inroads into the rest of the world. And then, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War in 1991, you still had, and you still have, a North Korean threat that was always that was far more immediate than the Soviets ever were. And in fact, without the Soviet Union, while the North Koreans always walk their own walk and were doing their own things at their own pace and priorities, nevertheless, there was still a sense that there was sufficient leverage from Moscow that would allow the Soviets to bring to bear and, if you will, keep a corral to a degree, Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung at that time, from doing anything that was crazy, stupid, or reckless. So the collapse of the Soviet Union, in some ways, forced North Korea to become, not allowed and forced North Korea to become more reckless, right? Because you had the end of some economic support, you had the end certainly of the military and security support, and you had the loss of the triangular relationship between Pyongyang, Moscow, and Beijing, which Pyongyang was incredibly skilled at exploiting in ways to get support. So you have greater self-reliance, both good and bad, in Pyongyang, which is both requiring, stripping the decision makers there of their ability to get external support, and then at the same time indulging them to do the more radical things that they might have hoped to done by themselves. So all of that pushes North Korea it makes North Korea a greater threat even after the Cold War has ended. And so then, in theory, of course, the strategically minded folks in Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul are all thinking to themselves that this threat from North Korea, which is becoming sharper as its capabilities develop, the nuclear question emerges in 1993, although it had been lurking in the background before that, that would be sufficient to push the two countries together, being Washington or being South Korea and Japan again. And in fact, when you had the first nuclear crisis in 93 and 94, you have Japan and South Korea essentially being corralled into the Korean Peninsula Economic Development Organization, the institution that was created to deal with that threat, and working with the U.S. and then putting out most of the money in many ways to actually address the North Korean threat. So you have that coordination. But I think over time you have the reemergence of concerns, the quick, the sprouting, if you will, of the identity issues, and the fact that there becomes more room for both societies and both political leaderships to play, if you will, political games with using domestic political issues as a way of securing political gains, and doing so at the expense of what would otherwise be seen as a strategic partner. And I think the relationship certainly was those problems became more severe until 1999, when you see South Korean President Kim Daejung, who is a real, the dissident who was about to have been murdered in the earlier part of our story, has now emerged as the president, has a true forward-looking vision, understands that South Korea's real future depends on a close and affirmative relationship with Japan, and thus the key to that is looking ahead, though, to the future and putting the past behind it and letting history be, if you will, something to remember, but certainly nothing to dominate, or something to learn from and remember, but nothing to dominate decision-making. So he strikes a deal with then Japanese Prime Minister Keizo Obuchi, and the two of them decide to formulate a forward-looking relationship. And that proceeds in potential, and I think is seen as the flowering, if you will, of the Japan-South Korea relationship. And many of us, including myself, really see that as a high watermark and a great tragedy, in that Obuchi died, Kim left office, and the relationship deteriorated for a number of reasons, larger cultural, larger national, psychological, but also because Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro, who took office in 2000 in Japan, was determined to go to Yasukuni Shrine, and in so doing gave the South Koreans a cudgel with which they could use to beat up on the U.S., beat up on Japan, just because of the history of that particular shrine or temple. Yes, I guess it's a temple officially, but and we can talk about that if your readers, if your audience, if you think they need some background there. But I mean, I think that was in many ways responsible for the deterioration of relations, because Koizumi was determined both to honor a campaign promise that he would visit the shrine, but as well to make the point, I think, that the Japanese could be properly patriotic without being, without repeating the past. And the South Koreans, I think, were not prepared to make such a fine distinction, and at the same time were happy to, to use Japan as a device by which they could rally around domestic politics. And at that time, of course, having a progressive government in Seoul was, in some respects, diminished the leverage that Washington had, and the U.S. was distracted by a number of other developments elsewhere in the world, and thus you didn't really have, I think, the attention that could have been paid, although we were certainly capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time, to some of the developments there. And it was the U.S. had other priorities at that moment, and I think it was a perfect storm of political, economic, and social conditions that allowed the relationship to deteriorate in ways that it did.
Well, let's open up that issue of national identity then, because this becomes fundamental to a lot of this. And of course, fundamental to the question you just raised then about the Yasukuni Shrine and why this is in any way controversial that prime ministers go there. So from both sides, you've mentioned a lot here about how both sides, it's in their interest to clearly cooperate despite the history here. But you've also touched on there this lingering shadow behind the whole scene. And in some ways, it seems to come down to a simple understanding that there's a feeling inside South Korea that Japan has never properly repented for the crimes of the past, or when it does, it somehow finds a way to walk it back. And then, of course, after the Korean War, the whole issues about islands and who owns them once again comes forward, and then that grows this feeling inside South Korean society that Japan are not really repentant for the past, or that they potentially are still a threat going into the future. And on the other side of this, it seems there's a Japanese nation that looks at South Korea, and perhaps other countries in the region too, as using this issue as a bulwark, something which they can keep using to punish Japan again and again and again. And they're not really interested in resolving the past. They're interested in using this as a form of national galvanization. So how do you see this challenge of identity politics? Because this runs through the whole problem here, and just how we can possibly move forward from there.
Well, I mean, We've only got, I think, probably got about 45 minutes. So unfortunately, that answer probably requires about a week. I'm not sure you've got, and I don't even know in a digital world if the tape is that long. It's that is the issue. I think it reflects a number of discrete and yet strands and arguments that are still woven together. And one of them is the simplest one is, this sense of history, that there is a profound, belief in South Korea that Japan has done horrific things in its past and never properly repented for them. And the historical misbehavior is a fact. Some Japanese, will try to minimize or argue it away in various rhetorical devices, which I think most of us would find reprehensible and just self-defeating and dumb. But that's a very, very, very slim minority. There are others that will make legal arguments about the claim to Dokdo Takeshima. There are others that will dispute the particulars, and all of that, it strikes me as being self-serving and self-defeating at the same time. Then there are, after that, the historical piece. The fact is that the Japanese have apologized. In fact, and I've forgotten, a few years ago, it was at least 27 separate apologies. And the emperor has made statements to that effect. The South Korea, Japanese prime ministers have made very clear statements to that effect. The problem for the South Koreans, or the problem actually for all of us, is, I think, the question of the sincerity of Japanese statements. And that's unfortunately a problem, one that will never be resolved, because sincerity is a matter of intention, right? And who's to divine what that intention is, and certainly the intention of a nation. There have been times when when the prime minister speaks, he speaks for the nation. And yet, of course, you can find dissent within both the government, because for all sorts of reasons, you don't always get the brightest and sharpest knives in a cabinet or an administration. You have situations that change. You have domestic political issues that may bubble to the surface, but don't change the larger sentiment or the larger sets of questions. And the subjectivity of intention, both among the people that make statements and those that interpret them, creates incredible opportunities for mischief making. And just repeatedly, the issue that you hear from South Koreans is that Japan is not sincere in its apologies, and that creates a dynamic here where the Japanese believe that their good intentions are not appreciated, and that in fact are not intended to be appreciated. And the belief at this point in Japan is that the South Koreans are far more interested in maintaining this issue to maintain the moral high ground, and will continue to move the goalposts no matter what Japan does, that it is no longer worth the trouble to issue an apology, to try to build a relationship, but to wait, in fact, until South Korea comes to its senses, and there are air quotes that go around that statement, and decide that they need Japan more than they need Japan as an obstacle, as an item for rallying domestic political support, etc. And thus, it's all up to the South Koreans to decide when they want to have a good relationship. And the smartest thing for the Japanese to do is just say, "Call us when you're ready to make a deal." So that dynamic, I think, is very, very troubling. But as you also allude to, the point that Scott Snyder and I argue in our book on Japan-South Korea relations, the Japan-South Korea identity clash, the argument that we make is that what's really fundamental here is a question of national identity, that Japan and South Korea are vital others to each. So, for example, it is precisely the formative experiences of the Korean occupation by Japan that really allow Koreans to declare who they are. That is the most important piece of their national identity. And national identity is socially constructed, so it's precisely a function of the political and elite class building a historical narrative that says this is who we are and these are the most important moments of our past. And the Japanese have figured prominently in that. And thus, the South Koreans need Japan as an enemy to exactly establish who they are today. That it provides them, a rallying point for national sacrifice, for national grievance, for concerted action and for a national identity, and that is fundamental. And if that is correct, there's exceptional and sadly great amounts of data that proves that point. Then we have a deep problem, because it means that you have to change at a most elemental level conceptions of who the South Koreans think they are, and the place of Japan in that identity before we're going to see progress. For the Japanese, on the other hand, the idea that they are seen as this evil other, that they are a continuing problem in the international system, that they have not repented, undoes and ignores the narrative that they've so carefully constructed since the end of World War II. The belief in Japan is that they were, victims as much as victimizers during World War II. They are, of course, the only country to have ever been attacked with atomic weapons, not only once but twice. That the Japanese people were victimized by a military clique that took over the government and made the people suffer as much as the countries that they occupied or invaded. And I mean, that may sound silly, that may sound gratuitous, it may sound condescending and just plain ignorant to countries that felt the lash of the imperial invasions, but that doesn't mean that it is not the way that history is understood in this country. And there is enough truth in that to make it a believable narrative. I mean, obviously, if it was just spun from whole cloth, you find it difficult. You wouldn't get the traction that it has developed. So South Koreans arguing that Japan has never repented for the past, that Japan retains the ability to again return to a militarist future, is to essentially deny the Japanese the identity that they have created for themselves since 1945 as a uniquely peaceful country, a peace-loving nation, one that makes extraordinary contributions to regional and global security through all sorts of non-military means, and thus, is essential to the conception of who the Japanese are. So the clash of these two competing visions, of these two neighbors, creates, a dynamic in which both of them, the sense of who they are, essentially denies the other the opportunity to be who it thinks it is. And that's just a formula for division. It's a formula for diplomatic chaos and for all the problems that we see today.
So let's build just a little bit from that. So you mentioned at the very start of this, the 1965 normalization agreement and how important this was. So before we jump on that, and of course this is going to be a huge part of all this, you ran through it a little bit there. And in 2015, there was this agreement, which you touched on as well. And the language from that agreement was finally and irreversibly resolved. Now that, for Japan, must have thought, okay, this is finally done. But of course, this is one of those agreements that goes back to 1965 as well, when once again, Japan thought they had resolved the issue. So before we, in part of digging those two things out, I might get you to open up the idea of Moon Jae-in. So many people might have expected Lee Moon-bak and Park Geun-hye as right-wing conservative politicians to be a lot more nationalistic in this regard. But when Moon Jae-in came to power, he's followed this line down the same track. And of course, there's this extraordinary incident of building after the 2015 agreement, which it was claimed to be finally resolved, there was an extraordinary building of a statue outside the Japanese consulate in the southern Korean city of Busan. So it's a statue to the comfort women issue, and it's right out front of the South Korean consulate. And of course, for Japan, this came across as a violation of their agreement, and a sign that South Korea are just not in good faith here. So all these issues rolling up again and again. Is there a possibility of this being resolved, and is it possibly to be resolved through a treaty, or is it just the wrong means? Because as you said, there's been 27 odd agreements here, 27 odd apologies, and these agreements run back to 1965. To 1965, and it doesn't seem to be making any progress. So is the future of this, in your estimation, is it through such agreements, or is it going to be a slow cultural move away from these things?
Both. I think let me see if we can go back and do this in a linear fashion that might create some coherence to this, because you're hitting all the right points. So I'm just kind of curious as to how we can tell this story in a good way. The 1965 normalization agreement was between a South Korean dictator, Park Chung-hee, and a democratic government in Japan. And it decided, essentially, it was the typical agreements that the Japanese were striking at the time that had, or not at the time, because they made many other diplomatic deal or straightened out diplomatic relations with a few notable exceptions in the San Francisco conference in 1951. Essentially what they said is that we will commence diplomatic normalization. We will move forward with our relationship, and the Japanese will provide several hundreds of millions of dollars in loans and grants and assistance to South Korea. And two, I think, important elements of this really need to be examined, I think, in very closely, or certainly taken note of. The first is that it is a military dictator, Pak himself, which is important given the fact that his daughter becomes president a few years or several decades after that. So this man's credentials as a representative of the nation can be subject to question if you want to look at political systems, etc. And my understanding of international law, and at one time in my life I was a lawyer, is that really doesn't necessarily change the fact that the type of government that signs an agreement doesn't necessarily change the legal status of an agreement that you sign. So in other words, the fact that he was a dictator does not mean that any agreement that he signed at that time in history was there subsequently null and void. Because the implications of that for international law are quite striking, and we can talk about it if you like. But what I've come to understand, and this is based on my reading of real scholars that plunge deep into the diplomatic history, is that, in fact, Pak specifically told and decided that he would not allow, and that the agreement was intended to to essentially take the place of the individual claims by, individual folks or people that had been wronged by the Japanese, precisely because he wanted to have control of any monies that the Japanese would give and provide to South Korea as a function of normalization to be used as he saw fit for the country. And that wasn't to line his pockets, but instead was used to, in fact, promote the development and the industrialization of Korea, and that to this day, for all of his detractors, is acknowledged to have been the basis for Korea's rise in since he was in power. And, that it was a very deliberate decision on the part of the government in Seoul at that time to decide to cut off the claims of the individuals. So it wasn't as if this was an accident. I believe the Japanese even offered some money for a fund, and Pak said no. He wanted the money all for the government to use for his purposes and not for individual purposes. Now, there's interestingly and literally this week an article was published, I forget if it was in Foreign Affairs or Foreign Policy, by a Korean lawyer in the United States who argued that decision was not his to make, and that international tribunals have subsequently ruled that you cannot cut off those individual claims. I am not sure, and it's not clear to me. That is, I believe he's made it as a moral argument. I'm not sure that the law is behind him on this, but there would be an interesting case. It strikes me that would open the door to some real trouble, insofar as what you're basically arguing is that we can revisit any international agreement when the government changes. And in fact, what has occurred in South Korea. So if that's our 65 deal, signed by a dictator and deliberately intended to cut off individual claims, then you fast forward to 2012, and Park Geun-hye, Park's daughter, becomes the president of South Korea. And because of her relationship with her father, it struck me as always being quite odd. From my perspective, you would have thought that she would have worked to defend her father's decisions and that she would have been a guardian of his legacy, whereas and thus the relationship with Japan would have been part of that, which had deteriorated weirdly enough, as you noted, under the reign of her predecessor, Im Young-bak, for a bunch of domestic political reasons. Her relationship had become quite fraught. So Park comes to office. You would have expected her perhaps to have honored her father's legacy and tried to rebuild relations with Japan because North Korea is a threat, because she is a conservative, because it's an easy political win in some respects. And instead, she retains a great distance, prioritizes the relationship with North Korea over that of Japan, works through China to build that relationship, which creates a great deal of anxiety here in Tokyo. And then lets eventually the relationship to deteriorate to a point where the U.S. has to actively intervene to literally bring the leaders, Prime Minister Abe and President Park, together in The Hague. And the photographs of that are quite striking as to how uncomfortable everyone looks. And the U.S. assumes the role that you had talked about earlier about really, really working to make the trilateral relationship work, and has some success. You begin to see the kind of a takeoff of the bilateral relationships, which culminates in the December 2015 comfort women deal, which the United States was very important in brokering, played a powerful role behind the scenes. I would urge your audience to look at any of the writings by a Stanford scholar named Dan Snyder, if you want to have some background on that. Dan covered it very well. Then Park is impeached, leaves office, and a left progressive Moon Jae-in comes to power, writing a powerful weight of disaffection against Park generally, the progressive sentiments generally as well. And a lot of that manifests in a belief that the comfort women issue was made, again, at a high level that disregarded the feelings, most importantly, of the comfort women, the surviving comfort women themselves, which is now down to just a few dozen left. And, there's a sense that the deal was struck for strategic imperatives, political reasons, and not to represent the mood of the people. And that gives real traction to the complaints that the left has against the deal in general, but which also just, I think, reflect a belief that this is an opportunity to rally support around among the progressive cause, and then, to beat up on the Japanese, which they've done quite successfully. So the relationship, for a start there, it actually looked like Moon was going to play this very shrewdly and would call for an investigation into the circumstances behind the agreement, and then would ultimately decide that for whatever the flaws were, that for the sake of the national interest, et cetera, that he was going to let it continue because it made a great deal of sense. Instead, his government decided that it was flawed, tore up the agreement, took down the foundation that had been set up to distribute the monies, and that was the most tangible symbol in many ways of the cooperation between the two countries. And then part of that becomes the degree to which the South Koreans are playing loose, if you will, with this notion of final and irreversible resolution of this problem, right? That they bring up sexual misconduct in wartime at international conferences, which makes the Japanese very concerned. They don't do anything about the Comfort Girl statute in Busan. They're not doing much about the original Comfort Women statute that was in Tokyo in front of the embassy in Seoul. I'm sorry, in Seoul in front of the embassy there. And you have I think a justified feeling in Japan that this is a government that is determined to undercut, if not just eliminate, essentially this agreement, and then as well as use the past in other ways. So you've got the government standing idly by, if not promoting the agreements or the lawsuits by forced laborers during the occupation period against Japanese companies, and again raising the subject in various international tribunals. All of that again has raised the issue, certainly infuriated the Japanese, and the Korean government's position throughout all of this has been these are independent processes. Particularly when it comes to the judiciary, we can't intervene. We're a democracy, and thus, we've got to let this play out as it will. And the Japanese see that as a very tactical and cynical move, and thus they're now waiting for and it keeps coming up. And you've got the usual tinder on the fire, if you will. I mean, you've got these long-standing issues, which are the long burning grievances, and then you throw little extra pieces on top of the flames, which make them really spark up. So that would be the comfort women issue in the particular form of the agreement. You've got these various issues in United Nations bodies where they bring up something that is pointed at the Japanese. You have the, again, disputed islands over Takeshima and Dokdo. And then most recently, one of the real problems has been this incident in December of last year when a Japanese aircraft flew near a South Korean naval vessel, and what is disputed is whether or not the naval vessel locked on its radar on the Japanese plane, which the Japanese claim it did, and the South Koreans claim it didn't, and we're still arguing over who was right and who was wrong to this day.
So on that point there about the military engagement, this is a good place to perhaps bring America back into this and to offer a slightly different lens. So that is a really deep history there of all the challenges and how stuttering the relationship has been between South Korea and Japan as they try to move forward here. But it seems to be the case, and this is often the case around the world, that despite the problems over history and some of the emotionally charged politics, countries still manage to often cooperate at a different level on a different track, and that is the military tract. And of course, in this situation, that has got to do with the American import, but also the looming threat of North Korea. So I might get to introduce that element right now.
Sure. Well, actually, we talked a little bit about North Korea earlier, but I mean, you're absolutely right that what has happened historically, right, is that for all of even when there has been political issues between the two countries, diplomatic questions, the militaries were working quietly together over the horizon, far away from the shores, because it was most often maritime naval cooperation was really where a lot of the progress was made. And you'll recall that I mentioned back in the 1980s when the three navies worked together to try to retrieve the black boxes after the Korean Airlines shoot down. And that was one really powerful and important case. But they'd always been working together. And, so those of us that look at this, you saw some diplomatic coordination and attempts to keep North Korea in a box, to cut off to keep it from exporting weapons, doing both surveillance of North Korean waters, of North Korean efforts to, misbehave. And they were working together quite well. And you had quiet, it was a very quiet process, but it was nevertheless a shock absorber for many of the political issues that were taking place. And that's what's most disturbing, I think, about right now. I mean, you had, for example, back before I get to the current case, back in 2012, you'll recall that there was an attempt to sign what they call a GSOMIA, a general agreement on the exchange of military information. And on several occasions, the two governments, Seoul and Tokyo, got very close to signing this agreement, which is nothing more than a pro forma document that really sets the format for sharing of information. The paper will be this color, it will be this size, it'll be laid out in the form, very dry, very bureaucratic, and very foundational. Korea has it, I think, with like several dozen other countries. They did not have it with the Japanese. And what it meant then was that the United States could share information with Japan. The United States could share information in Korea and with vice versa. But that information, any information that was to come from Seoul to Tokyo, would have to go through the United States with the approval of both countries. There was never direct communications officially between the two governments. And if you went and talked to naval, or not naval, but military planners in both governments, and alliance officials, I can't tell you how many times an American official would say it was remarkable how they would go to Seoul, they would go to the headquarters, and they could see the situational awareness of the region, and Japan was a black spot. And then they would go to Tokyo or Japan and look at, again, a similar, planning office or, headquarters for the U.S. forces Japan, and there would be a similar black spot over Korea because you just did not have the, they didn't have the protocols that were set up to, illuminate what the other was doing. So in 2012, they tried twice, and just about each time they were about to sign that deal, political pressures in Seoul were such that it forced the cancellation, in one case, hours before the signing of the agreement was to take place. It finally followed a few years ago, but the fact of the matter is it's been done so much under the United States pressure that in the absence of an engaged American president, it is very, very difficult to get much done between the two countries. And unfortunately, this particular moment in American history, our president is not very interested in that particular problem, and thus he's not in a position to be knocking the heads together in ways that would move the three countries together as in the past.
So on that issue there as well, this idea of American invasion, engagement, and Donald Trump, you have written a few times quite critically about the pivot. So not so much the pivot, but the idea that the pivot may be over. This idea that the pivot to Asia, this grand strategy that Barack Obama had this idea for, where he's going to more closely align American interests with that in Southeast Asia. Now, I wonder how you see this engagement under Donald Trump and the changes that are happening there. Everyone knows about the bluster and some of the, I suppose, offhand and casual ways in which he seems to deal with things that doesn't have a long policy decision process behind it. But is the pivot still there? Is it still functioning? Or are American interests steadily pulling back from those days of Barack Obama?
No, well, first, I always took issue with the pivot. I always prefer the word rebalance. I mean, it's semantic, but it has potentially ugly implications. So let's just call it that, and I'll feel happier. Mm-hmm. So, but to the degree that the rebalance represented, I think, a fundamental reorientation of the American foreign policy interests. The fact is that the rebalance was born from the recognition that the world was changing from a bipolar order and from one that was centered on the Atlantic to a tripolar order that reflected the rise of Asia and the extraordinary dynamism economically and the resulting political and strategic significance of the region. That's not changing. And so while the Trump presidency is premised first and foremost on erasing everything that his predecessor did, so you certainly can't call it the rebalance or the pivot, but this free and open Indo-Pacific is bound from the same premises. So the degree of salience, the importance that Asia and the Asia-Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific as we want to call it, its importance in American foreign policy, that is going to be a constant. And now the particular forms of engagement may back up, right, in the sense that the rebalance was also a rebalance, if you will, of the tools in the toolbox, that it reflected very much an attempt to reduce the overall significance of the military and to emphasize diplomacy and economic relations. On that side, we've got a problem. And that's because the foundational economic thinking of President Trump, at least, and unfortunately several other people in his administration, senior officials, this notion of making America great again. And the president's economic understanding is that is best understood through the crudest recitation of current account balances. In other words, the U.S. needs to be always in surplus, which is absurd, and the U.S. then needs to be bringing jobs back to the United States, which means, translated, that the U.S. policy at this point is to take money out of the region and other regions, right, to bring the money back to Washington and to bring the money back to the U.S. and the jobs back to the U.S. And that is, first of all, it's a absurd economic policy. It's, no reasonable economist will tell you that it's workable. It is not going to succeed, and it's not going to solve the problems, but it also just completely undercuts the image and what the United States has attempted to accomplish for the last 70 years in this part of the world. And and to the degree that if you want to bring China into this and all of the concern that talks about spreading Chinese influence, is precisely because China's attitude, whatever you think of debt traps, et cetera, is you've got a problem, here, let us help you fix it, and we're going to provide the money, where the American attitude is we've got a problem, we're going to take money out from you to fix our issues. And so it's short-sighted, it's wrong, and it's on that level, the rebalance, or at least the conceptual principles, foundations of it are threatened. But the larger point of which the United States has to stay engaged with this part of the world, that is going to be enduring for history as long as we can see going forward.
So let's bring in that idea of China then, because we've been talking about the three nations, of course, that we're talking about this trilateral relationship for. And of course, the fear for a lot of them is China, and of course, the rise in China. Now, it offers a couple of different perspectives, at least from what I've found throughout your research here. It does offer a certain risk, and certainly for countries like South Korea, the idea that Trump reaching out to China to solve issues such as the North Korean issue, for example, sidelines them in this regard and offers a way in which they may be pushed along to the side here. But it also offers a means by which South Korea and, I suppose, Japan could have much greater cooperation. And this is the economic cooperation. So after America put the THAAD missile defense system inside South Korea, China put economic sanctions on them for this. Not America, but on South Korea. And this is potentially an opportunity there for countries like Japan to build a much closer relationship there through a shared risk and a shared fear of a rise in China. So I wonder how you see them these days. I suppose it has changed slightly over the last couple of years with the new import of Trump's trade war as well.
Well, let's go back to first principles. And I realize we've left some interesting pieces of this out. Let's start with from the Korea-Japan perspective. If as an American strategist, right, as somebody who looks at this through the lens of strategic relationships and what I think is in the best interests of the three countries, and maybe even Chinese interests as well, but put them aside for a second. South Korea and Japan for an American, and I would assume for an Australian, and for many people, should be partners. That's the key word, should be. Why? They have similar histories. They have similar values. They have similar political systems. They're committed to democracy, openness, freedom. They both, they're allies of the United States. They are separated by a relatively small body of water. Geographically, they're the same. They both look at China and see it as an overweening country that has reasons to make them nervous. They're both threatened by North Korea. By all this large body of ideas, there's every reason that Japan and South Korea should be working together. And I've argued in my work that if they do not find common cause strategically, that there's going to be a huge problem because China having differences and having different objectives, and I think that are not necessarily as aligned with those of Seoul and Tokyo as is the United States, is going to do its very best to isolate them, drive a wedge between them, and prefer to deal with them on a bilateral basis where its power and its influence is far, far greater. And it will have, a greater ability to tell them what to do in many situations. So, the starting point for all of this is we should see these countries working together. Now, if we look at discrete political issues, however, there are differences. So the government in South Korea today is far more determined to make a deal with North Korea for a bunch of different reasons. They're Koreans. They don't see that there's the inimical hostility. There's a belief that if North Korea is hostile to the West or to the United States and South Korea, it is because it feels insecure, and that the trick is always erase the insecurity, and that then you will see a far more accommodating country. And I think at the same time there's a belief in South Korea that we really want to make the North Korean problem go away, because then we can focus on our own domestic issues, which from a progressive perspective is reorganizing our society in ways that make it more equitable, that diminish the power of the chaebol and the established capitalist classes. North Korea is in some senses a distraction, apart from the larger notion of a single Korean identity. So on that level, if you look at North Korea through that particular lens, you can also make the calculation that because of the longstanding relationship between China and North Korea, that the road to Pyongyang runs through Beijing. And thus, if you really want to make a deal with the North Koreans or deal with the North Koreans, you've got to make nice with the Chinese. Well, the Japanese, first of all, don't feel as immediately threatened by the North as the South Koreans do, but they also believe that if North Korea ever uses a nuclear weapon, it's going to be against them. And I think that's probably a reasonable determination. Secondly, they're certainly not prepared to privilege cooperation with China over the United States, as the South Koreans have in the past suggested they're going to do. There's never a danger that South Korea was going to leave the alliance, but certainly they were prepared to risk frictions with the U.S. over China. And that's something that frankly, Japan has not, I think, been willing to do, although there have been moments again in the last decade or so when you've seen what could have been a troubling development. And then, so you've got differing views as well of China. I mean, I think the Japanese look at China as a genuine rival, and the Chinese look at the Japanese as a threat, whereas the South Koreans look at China, accept China as just this monstrous presence that they really can't, counter, because they are, after all, a shrimp among whales, they being the South Koreans. So they're not in a position to compete with the Chinese. They also feel that the Chinese can be an instrument to the accomplishment of their issues with North Korea. So that fundamentally shifts, if you will, the nature of the views of the regime in Beijing. And so that shifts as well the dynamics between Washington, between each other, and these, again, this larger regional relationship. And at the same time, I think, China is, Japan and South Korea have emerged less complementary economies, but more, competitive ones. So you look at them and they're largely creating the same things. It's not as if neither of them is going to be sending parts made or to build. Samsung parts aren't generally going to be put together in Japan, and similarly Panasonic parts aren't going to be put together in Korea, right? They're both going to be sending them to China or elsewhere in Southeast Asia for that. That's the complementarity in the economic and the production systems that would allow them to work together. Instead, it is ultimately Samsung against Sony or Samsung against Panasonic or what have you, in ways that create greater friction and make for a slightly more contentious relationship. So across the board, it looks to me as though the first issue, the question of the convergence of strategic and long-term interests, is overshadowed by more immediate political concerns and more immediate business concerns. And that's, I think, what could, in theory, be a leavening factor ends up being instead something that contributes to the troubles in the relationship.
So let me introduce a new factor in this. And of course, this is going to be slightly challenging for you to boil down into a single answer, simply based on the fact that you have a whole new book out on the topic, which is available.
And I've also proven to be unable to boil anything down.
Well, that too, yes. So your new book is called Peak Japan, okay? Right. And that is out at the moment. I've pre-ordered. I encourage listeners to go and pre-order it as well. And it's going to be very hard to boil down, as I said. But the idea here is that Japan is facing its future is going to be one of decline, and it's going
Right.
to have to in some way come to terms with that idea. But this is
Mhm.
also, in some ways, I mean, there are differences, and South Korea has a slightly different off-ramp in this regard, in as far as a potential reunification with North Korea. But South Korea has many of the same challenges coming from demographic issues and aging populations, and just how they see themselves inside the world itself. So I might get you to touch on that issue briefly. This place in which these two countries that for many years have simply been expanding and upon expansion. This is the history that people remember, and they are coming towards a place in their future in which not just stasis but actual decline may have to become the norm for them, and they're going to have to find a way to live in this new world and this new reality.
True. And make sure that if I don't remember to come back to it, because we're leaving one important piece of this out. For all the animosities that divide the two countries politically and strategically, instrumentally, if you will, there is at the same time, some powerful exchanges, grassroots, cultural interchanges between the two that suggest that there are opportunities for, there are things that we could build a positive relationship upon between Japan and South Korea. And just make sure we get back to that. But thanks for plugging the book. It's a labor of love. It's been in the works for about 5 years. Basically, my argument is that this is the apex, the apogee of Japanese influence in the world, and that for a variety of reasons, structural and attitudinal, that it's downhill from here. Whether it's a sharp decline or whether it will be just a gradual, sharp collapse or a gradual decline, I don't know. But if current trends continue, I do not see how Japan can do anything other than diminish in the world. The reasons for that are, the structural reasons are, an inverted demographic pyramid, which is Japan is the oldest, grayest country in the world, meaning that its population is age 65 and older is the largest in the world, about a third or 28-30%, and it's going to get higher than that. It will continue to grow. South Korea is probably the closest. It is a crisis. Japan is anticipating the problems that South Korea will face. I was talking to a Japanese politician yesterday afternoon, and we were discussing. He was telling me that his interest is in this 100 years longevity. That's the chief issue that he's been working on, and that the country has to face. And I think that the prime minister has actually set up a panel to look at that. But so you've got the demographic problem on one end. The Japanese population is currently 127 million. The current Japanese government has said that we are going to accept a decline in the population to 100 million, which is remarkable to me. In so many ways, it makes a certain amount of sense that you're getting older, you're getting smaller. In this era, you don't necessarily, it's far greener, if you will, more sustainable to have a smaller population. But to concede essentially a fifth, to allow the population to drop from 27 to 100 million, is to allow your country to shrink by 1/5. And the people that remain are going to be much older. That's a remarkable thing to do. It's just in many ways unheard of. And in fact, it's doubtful whether they're going to be able to hold the line at 100 and whether or not it'll drop to 87 million over time. So you've got shrinking population. You have, and then a debt, which is, the Japanese debt is anywhere from 155 to 280% of GDP, depending on which particular numbers you're using and whose numbers and whose debt you're looking at. It's the highest of any developed country in the world, even higher than that of Greece, which has always been the basket case for economic problems in the world. The difference, however, is the Japanese debt is owed to itself. It doesn't owe it to foreign creditors, and thus it is ultimately, it's not susceptible to foreign exchange risks, and there's very little danger that it can't be paid back. In fact, there's a brand new paper by the former IMF chief economist, which came out this week, that argues that Japan should not be concerned about dealing with its debt, because in a low interest rate environment in which it exists and which is foreseeable for the future, the economy will always grow more than zero, and thus the debt will always be sustainable. It's a very controversial proposition, but certainly one that's worth taking on board, particularly if we're entering a transitional period, or we've entered a transition in the way that the global economy works, and that we need to be looking at Japan and deflation or as the harbinger of the future for developed economies. So on top of those reasons, those are compelling, but the most important things that I argue in the book are that there's an attitudinal shift in Japan. And that is that for a whole bunch of reasons, what I call good and bad, the Japanese are not prepared to make the changes that they need to make in their society to keep up with the dynamism of the external world. Again, very, very clear. And I've had a lot of arguments about this. I'm not suggesting that Japan is unchanging. I first came here in 1991, and I have been, the degree of change in this society over that period is extraordinary. It is not the same country that it was. Many of the changes, almost all the changes have been for the better. Nevertheless, it is not changing fast enough. And why is that? Well, first, because the Japanese are small C conservative. They're very risk averse. They are not prepared to change absent a guarantee, and nobody can offer a guarantee in the future, that what they're going to get is better than what they've got. And what they've got right now is pretty damn good. I mean, I live in Tokyo, and thus I find it, it's a glittering, gleaming city. It's always new. Some of the best fashion, certainly the best restaurants in the world. All due respect to Seoul, where I've had some great meals. More Michelin stars in Tokyo than any city in the world, more than twice as many as Paris, number 2. And Osaka and Kyoto are numbers 3 and 4 on the Michelin list. So, I mean, incredible food, great shopping, phenomenal culture. It's safe, it's secure, it is comfortable, it is efficient. It is Tokyo, for sure, is an extraordinary place. The science fiction writer William Gibson said, if I ever want to go see the future, I go to Tokyo for a week. It is a great place to live. But it is also one, where that is somewhat stagnant in the sense of developing the entrepreneurship. The English language skills among the Japanese are historically and traditionally the worst in Asian countries. It's low ranking on innovation and entrepreneurship by every global ranking. The number of students that are going overseas is shrinking. It's becoming uchimuki, inward looking. The comfort creates a complacency, and the comparisons among young Japanese to their Korean and Chinese counterparts, they notably say we don't have to try as hard as they do because we have a future. In a shrinking population, it's easier to find jobs. And in fact, the difficulty now is finding labor in Japan. It's not about finding jobs. And you have young South Koreans coming here to find some employment opportunities, which again speaks to the opportunities that for future good relations between the two countries. You put all of this together, and there's more reasons. There's Buddhist philosophy of quietism. There's the Japanese cultural predilection for wa and harmony, for resilience, of stoicism. All of this, as one politician put it to me, is an absolute brake on change. And thus the Japanese are not disposed, absent a glaring shock that typically has to come from the outside. The genesis of this book was the March 11th triple catastrophe, which ultimately cost Japan 5% of its GDP. Even that wasn't enough to shock the country out of its complacency and to bring about really deep-rooted change that many think is necessary. Not for Japan to be a great place to live, but for Japan to retain its status as one of the top 2 or 3 leading countries in the world. Now, Japan can shrink in ways that would allow it, and it can change in ways that would allow it to retain a position as really a greatly influential country in the world. The problem, too, and again, this came up in my conversation with the Japanese politician yesterday, is that the current leadership is committed to notions of national power and leadership that are very conventional and do not match what the Japanese people believe in and what I think the country is capable of providing. When you've got debt, when you have a country that is deeply wedded to Article 9 of the Constitution, the anti-militarism clause, and that is not prepared to really get entangled in foreign controversies. The idea of a forward-leaning security profile is very problematic. When you have fiscal debts, right, of, like I said, hundreds of percent of the GDP, you're not going to be in a position to spend money on the things you need to have a stronger military or defense establishment. Historically, we always talk about, there's always a choice between guns and butter. Well, in Japan, it's going to be between guns and wheelchairs. This is definitely a country that's going to have difficult choices figuring out how to vote and spend its money, shrinking dollars in the future. And thus, all of this conspires, in my mind, to diminish Japan's presence on the international stage. And for me, and I would hope for South Koreans, that, the issue then becomes Japan is an important, invaluable partner in so many different things. How do we prevent them from becoming so distracted by internal troubles that they become less, that we lose the ability to resort to those resources, to those contributions that they can make? And how do we prevent Japan from becoming a destabilizing influence on the international stage? And for the U.S., as an ally and partner, I worry that we're misreading what's happening here, and they see the Abe government as representative of the people, which unfortunately, I'm afraid, in terms of its outlook, it's not. And so we go into a crisis, and the Japanese are going to be unable to deliver, and that creates a genuine crisis in our relationship. So my book is an attempt to better reconcile the reality of Japan with the expectations of it.
So let's push into that question then, the one that you mentioned before, the idea of this grassroots relationship, because I suppose a lot of what we've been speaking about today is the reasons for why these countries should cooperate, but a whole series of other factors that often impede in at least in theory, impede in the process of this sort of big, broad issues. But as you mentioned there is a whole series of low-level cooperation. I suppose you touched on a couple there, this idea of this economic exchanges between the two countries and South Koreans working inside Japan. And in many ways, anyone that's lived in the two countries just knows how deeply interconnected the two are, despite the fact of all the identitarian overlay. So let's open up that question then, this grassroots relationship between the two countries.
Well, and that's really important. And I think both countries acknowledge, and if you look, there's a number of opinion polls that make this case. But if you look at, the understanding of the two publics, I think they recognize, for all of their difficulties and for all of their problems, that they really see the other as an important partner. And you see that while they have really bad impressions of each other at this moment, they also recognize that they are similar and that they would like to have good relations with the other. I mean, I don't believe there's just this animus that's so deep and profound. You look at the number of tourists that are going from Japan to Korea, it's been going up every year. You're seeing intermarriage. I mean, there's always odds and ends, if you will, where whether it was they used to call Fuyuno Sonata, Winter Sonata, right, where you had this extraordinary outwelling of affection for South Koreans in this one show, particularly these middle-aged Japanese women back in the early 2000s, right? You still have incredible, it may feel trivial in the sense that, we're talking about cosmetics, we're talking about food, we're talking about shopping, but it is, if you will, the things that touch most people's lives immediately and in a daily sense. And the issues that we've been discussing, the island disputes, the comfort women, for all except a very small minority, those are not the things that that register in their daily lives. And so there is, I think, among Koreans and Japanese, a belief that while the relationship is bad, they feel, though, that it should be better and that they would prefer it to be better. That they also feel as though the relationship with the other country, 90% of South Koreans, I'm looking really quickly at a Genron poll, which is a Japanese NGO that does a poll every year on Japan-Korea relations with the East Asia Institute. 90% of South Koreans reply that Japan is important. And 60% of Japanese saying the same about South Koreans. They pretty much, align when it comes to this idea that their relationship should be good, but the problem is that how does each polity look at the other? Whose responsibility is it to fix these problems? And then each one is pointing at the other and essentially prepared to sit out and wait until the other makes the first move, and that's an absolute recipe for disaster because neither of them has sufficient trust to take the first step, and both of them are waiting for the other to make a material change in circumstances.
So you've just touched on it there a little bit, but as a final question, I might ask you a quite impossible question to answer here, and that is how you see this developing into the future. And I know there's a lot of facets that you can bring into this, but your book published on the topic was published a few years ago now, and I wonder how you see it developing, whether you are more hopeful today than you were back then or less hopeful, or just how you see the future of this trilateral relationship going into the future. And just your outlook on the region and America's role with these two countries.
There's good questions. I mean, when the book came out, not to pat ourselves on the back, but we called it. We were right. I think our analysis of the problems was right then, and it's correct now. We provided two options for the future. One I called the big, status quo, if you will, and the grand bargain. And, we made some bold calls. We called, the status quo was we pushed diplomatic negotiations. We push for cooperation at the working levels. We do a lot of what we're doing. We just do a little bit more of it. I think what we've discovered is that it's been harder to maintain what we were doing at that time because of the virulence of the domestic political problems between Seoul and Tokyo. And so for a while, we called for things like I wanted President Obama to go to Hiroshima to make a statement about reconciliation to set an example, and he did it. And then Prime Minister Abe went to Pearl Harbor, and as a reciprocal gesture. And we felt as though we took credit for that. It was all our idea, right? Nobody else had ever thought of that before, so we deserved all the credit. And then we called for some other statements, big bold moves on comfort women, etc., giving up their, which for temporarily at least, it looked like that was going to happen. Called for, the Japanese, we think, should renounce their claim to Dokdo Takeshima because it was never going to change. That's a step too far, but I still think it's the right thing to do. And essentially what the South Koreans had to do through all of this was just make a commitment to the future and quit using Japan as a domestic political club. And it's possible, but it's hard, and it's proven too hard to do. Clearly, a key has been the readiness of the United States to engage and to push the two countries together to overcome their domestic political problems. And right now, the U.S. president is not disposed to do that. That is not that kind of engagement, that sort of role for the U.S. on so many different levels is just not what he sees the U.S. is doing. It's an extraordinary departure from the past, but I think we all now know how much of a departure this president is. So, it is not enough to have assistant secretaries of state or director generals of the foreign ministries or the director generals and assistant secretaries of defense get together to do trilateral meetings, or like as we're seeing in this Shangri-La meeting right now. You've got the North Korean negotiators from the three countries meeting in Singapore. That's good. That's pro forma. That's not enough, because the depth of the problems are such that it has to come from the very, very top leadership. It has to be the president, not even the vice president. And there certainly isn't a similar figure to the vice president in Japan or South Korea. You have to have the U.S. president making the case to his allies that they have got to create this relationship. And it's just not enough to tell them and force them to bang heads together, if you want to be crude, but it's to set an example on both a practical, a moral, a strategic level. And that's not what this president's going to do. And my feeling is that in the absence of that and in the absence of a really, really negative event, in other words, for the United States, the thing that would push South Korea and Japan together, historically, according to scholar Victor Cha, right, what has pushed Seoul and Tokyo together was the threat of an American withdrawal from the region, they no longer had the luxury of relying on the United States. However, it's not clear to me, it's not certain to me that today that would happen, that the leadership in South Korea would not allow the identity historical issues to still rise to the surface and predominate in their thinking. And you might not see Seoul then at that moment recognize that it needs to forge a different type of relationship with China. I don't think Japan would do that as yet. But nevertheless, the question, it really is an interesting and an unknowable, is that in the event of an American sort of retreat, you would see Seoul and Tokyo get closer together as in the past. Interestingly enough, after the first Singapore summit, the U.S. decision to suspend the military exercises with the South Korea, I think, infuriated perhaps the Japanese most of all, and unnerved the Japanese most of all. Every conversation I had since then has started with the premise, when we talk about the peninsula, is the understanding the Japanese would say, about a single operational theater. That Japan's own national defense and security is deeply, deeply intertwined, if not completely indistinguishable from that of what's happening on the Korean Peninsula. And so in that sense, you do have this identification of interest between Japan and Korea that would suggest, at least in Japan, they would be ready to work more closely to Seoul if the United States made some sort of precipitous, and I would argue badly informed, move elsewhere. But you don't know that would necessarily be the thinking in Seoul. And so that it's very difficult to say what the future holds. I would suggest at this point that it's going to have considerably, there'll be more frictions, that there doesn't seem to be, in the absence, what you need, frankly, is you need a decision by the South Korean government to put an end to these forced labor suits. That looks to me to be the biggest problem. And there's a way, of course, that it could be done. South Korea could say, we've let the legal issues run their course. We understand that justice requires this, but the national interest requires something else. And so we are just not going to enforce those judgments. And we appreciate the fact that the moral cause is on the side of the plaintiffs, but the national interest is what it is. And I think that what that would then do is give the moral victory to the wronged victims. Then it would create the conditions in which Japanese companies and the Japanese government can say, all right, this is the expression of interest in a better relationship. Now we can do our part. It's up to South Korea then to make the first move. If the government were to make that step and to privilege, if you will, the strategic relationship over the particular interests of history, then you might see Japan working to address the historical wrongs in a I think, a more concerted fashion. And that might well prove to be the way that you move this forward. But there is no indication at this point that the South Korean government understands the stakes and is prepared to make that judgment, because it would require it essentially to risk its support from its most fervent, its base, if you will.
So that's a great nuanced point to leave this off on. The book in which this discussion has been based, at least in part upon, there's a lot more there that we couldn't get to, is called The Japan-South Korea Identity Clash, East Asian Security and the United States. And of course, Brad's new book, which is out now, I do encourage people to go and get this as well, is called Peak Japan, The End of Great Ambitions. Now, of course, this podcast is also based upon some of the other articles that Brad has put online. I used them as well for the research for this, and they're a great little introduction to Brad's work if you want to build yourself into it. So I will link them below as well. So it's been absolutely fascinating. Thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast, Brad Glosserman.
I realize, thanks, Jed. It's been, you've really indulged me. I also realize we've been at this for almost 90 minutes. I hope your listeners survive this my browbeating and long-winded answers.
I'm sure they will.
Thanks for having me. It's been a real pleasure talking.